So history is the natural way that connects us with the truths of the past and make them present today. So what's cool about that is that G.K. Chesterton describes tradition as a democracy of the dead, and that moves itself into the realm of history. The fact of the matter is that history shows, and there's multiple strands of history we can talk about, but especially in the history of the church, that your ancestors weren't dumb and they were probably more clever than you are. And so from history, we glean not only the reality of, in specifically the church's kind of presence in the world as a force of divine will, but just generally speaking, that connection again with our ancestors, with our grandparents, with the saints, to tie it back into the church, with those who've come before us and who want to spread their wisdom down. The way that it's often taught in school, and I attended public school, so pray for me, but the way that I was taught in school was that there was no real trajectory of what things were tied in. You're taught names, dates, people who died, kind of a thing. And it's not real. And so the past isn't real to you. The best kind of history that I've read, that I've understood, is that which is able to set you in the dynamics of the time. So to give an example, one of the last history books I read that I got such a kick out of was The Last Days of the Inca by MacQuarrie. This talks about the fall of the Incan Empire from the Incans' history as it's recorded mostly by the Spanish, because they didn't actually have a written language, and also the early Spanish conquistadors, and understanding that a lot of these men were not just like the grand like nobles of Spain all the time, but a lot of them were actually like poor bastard sons, like the last vestiges of civilization, looking for a life in the dangerous new world. And so you understand like the dynamics that are suddenly at play, and the way that Kim ties it in is by pointing it also to the person who discovered the ruins of Machu Picchu, who was actually an American from Hawaii. So you get all these different dynamics at play, and it just unlocks a breadth of the trajectory of everything. And that's why I say again, your ancestors weren't dumb. They knew a lot more things than you probably know, actually. And you'd be really surprised about how many of the same sorts of passions, hardships, triumphs, and failings that they had that we might share in the future. So it's an easy way to show what to do. I tend to be a military historian and a church historian. So in terms of military history, you can't go wrong with something like The Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman. She is a premier historian on the First World War, and that book is absolutely brilliant. You couldn't go wrong with 1776, which is a very popular one by David McCullough, which talks about, well, the revolution, the Battle of Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill in 1776. For church history, this is one where you can do a lot of different things. I very much liked, there's a book called The Glory of the Crusades by, the name escapes me, but it's by one of the very prominent members who's been on Catholic Answers before. He's like a premier Catholic historian. But anyway, that's a really, really good depth of church history. And also that's reclamation of church history, because nowadays it's like the easy thing to do, the chic thing to do is to badmouth the Crusades, although both Catholics and non-Catholics alike don't know anything about the Crusades. Well, here's a funny thing. So it's a historical mistake to look at the Bible as one book and say, aha, it is historically accurate or like scientifically accurate in its totality. The Bible is a library. For instance, you would never take Song of Songs as history, right? The Song of Solomon is it's poetry and it's beautiful. So I think that we kind of make a mistake by taking it as a trajectory. There are some books that are shockingly accurate. So again, you do take like what's happened in the New Testament, take what's happened in the Gospel of John, which I'm very, very fond of. Yeah, that's probably historically accurate. Christ died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again is extraordinarily true. How other books of the Bible, I mean, it ventures. I think that the book of Exodus tends to be a historical account. I think that the book of Genesis tends to be a historical account, although how to fit in the poetry of the grand narrative to speak to the truths of Genesis can all depend. And the church actually hasn't made a proclamation on this. So yeah, there's some books, however, the book of Deuteronomy I take as historically accurate. The book of Revelations is going to be historically accurate. But remember that there is a great narrative that's beyond even human comprehension that's woven into every fabric of the Bible. So some of it's very historical, some of it's very poetic.
This is Jordan Pacheco. In case you guys don't know, he has his own podcast. Please let them know of the name.
Yes. The name is the Glad Trad Podcast, and I host it with my good buddy, Rudolfo Carlos, and we make videos every... whenever we feel like it.
Yeah.
And when
The Glad Chad podcast is highlighting the rise of Orthodoxy and Catholic tradition back in resurgence, and especially since the Summer of Shame, which happened 2 years ago. So rather than focusing on all the angering things of the church and seeing that the walls are falling down, we wanted to focus on the really great resurgence of Orthodoxy. This includes a rise in interest in Latin Mass. This includes a finding of Ember Days, which I'm practicing right now, so pray for me. This includes the rereading and rediscovery of a lot of spiritual masters and saints and the history of the church that has been lost and put away a lot of times for the past 50 years. So we highlight those very positive kind of things because it's a great way of navigating the very tumultuous world that is the Catholic faith at the moment and being happy all the time while doing it.
Okay, perfect. Well, please feel free to check out Jordan's podcast. Support. They're doing great things, and they're just strong men of the church. So we got to follow them. Now, okay, you were making some very, very, very good comments on the history, but I think ultimately what it comes down to is, why does this matter, especially to the youth? How do they connect with that?
Well, what's funny is I don't even think it's just exclusionary to the youth nowadays. What I've actually found is that young people are more hungry for history, where there's been a put away, if we want to become generational just for a second, there's been a put away sometimes by older generations. But for the youth in particular, the reason why it's very important is because history connects us with our ancestors. G.K. Chesterton describes tradition as the democracy of the dead. And so that's more than just the customs and stories and songs. All of that has to do with history. And history is a great way of looking to the past to discover where you're going in the future. So there are some things which your ancestors knew and learned that has been forgotten to the sands of time. And so the first trajectory of history is that you're not as clever and smart and fresh and hip and modern as you think you are. Every man at every point in history has looked at himself and thought himself a modern man. And whether that was pushing out the first of the Dutch flutes ships out into the water, or whether that was discovering the cotton gin or jazz music or anything. And what's funny is that and for the church's purpose, history connects us very deeply to the lives of the saints. These are no longer lofty pictures hanging in chapels and cathedrals. These are men and women of God who lived and served the Lord in the best capacity. These are people who walked with Christ. These are people who walked with the Blessed Virgin Mary. And it was real and it was tangible. And that connection accentuates all other aspects of the faith, I find.
Okay, lovely. And why is it important to follow the lives of the saints? And why do you think, as far as in connection to the history of the church and these saints' lives, how do they merge?
Well, I guess it kind of, for me, I'll use like the example of one of my patron saints right now, which is Sir Thomas More. So Sir Thomas More is born into a world that's about to go topsy-turvy. Sir Thomas More, by the way, just in terms of saintly life, was a saint who, as far as we know, never had a beatific vision. He never saw the Blessed Virgin Mary or Christ, before him in that kind of way. What he found in his own life, and as whether that was his life as a lawyer, his life as a father, or as Lord Chancellor of Britain, which was like the Prime Minister at the time, he discovered that the law which God has given, condensed onto man, was the highest order that one could attain. And so he watched that ripped apart in real time.
Wait, can you say that again? That was very good.
Well, I might have forgotten what I said. But the law which God had given, which man condenses, because man's law should be based upon God's law, is the highest form of order that we can attempt to attain to tie ourselves back to God.
Okay, now.
So by that, we look at that, and of course the question at the time was Henry VIII's marriage, and it wasn't even his first marriage, right? It was the second. So the answer was that Thomas knew that he couldn't tear down the laws of the church to appease the laws of England. You can't make a discrepancy between the law of God and the law of man. That's dangerous, and that places ourselves on this faulty humanistic pedestal. So the point of our history is this. So Thomas More watched the church in real time be ripped away from him. Everyone but one or two bishops voted essentially to do the Church of England. Henry VIII declared himself the head, and Thomas More would later lose his life. When he was born, throughout his entire life to when he died, there was no conviction that he didn't believe that was different. He didn't waver. And so for us as historians, to tie that back into our current day, now there is a persecution of orthodoxy going on in the church. To actually speak the truths of the church as it's happened throughout history, to watch your churches ripped apart from you, which is what we've done for the past 50 or 60 years in real time. And it's been longer than that, of course, but that's just been the time we've really seen it, is crazy. And so in order to navigate a path forward, before we start tearing apart every single foundation, uprooting every root that we've ever planted, we can learn a lot of inspiration from the saints who've actually gone through those sorts of times. Real quick, you have to remember that St. Francis of Assisi came around, at the right time in the right place, because the church had just come out of something called the pornocracy, which was a time period where the papacy and the curia was essentially run by a bunch of highbrow Roman prostitutes. And so the court of resurgence that Francis found was owing a lot of the times to the fact that from this great darkness produced this great light.
And you know what I think is very good about all of this is that sometimes you read about the saints and they have such enormous, incredible stories that it may sometimes be hard to place yourself in it. But then you back it up by, okay, this is set in an actual time and history. So you read about the history and everything that's going on there, and you're correlating with it. And so now you're building the context around it so that you can begin to visualize and understand for yourself who the saints are and what was happening at that time. How do you correlate this church history with faith? I think that especially now that people, they don't find a necessity in having to look back. So do you think that it will deepen your knowledge in order to know more about the church, including the church fathers and again, even pre-Bible? Okay. So how do we make that of an importance, or if it even is?
The one thing about church history that is why I grafted onto it is because, as you kind of talked about before, it gives a context to the great spiritual undertones of everything. The Bible's a perfect example of this. It's one thing to read 1st and 2nd Maccabees, but what is the Maccabean revolt first off? Did anyone ever know that the Romans actually offered a sort of alliance to the kingdom of Israel at that time? And then we saw what happened with that, you know? But what you get is this for all the things of history that led up to Christ being born where? In Bethlehem. Where is Bethlehem? Oh, it's in Galilee. No. Look at the wider picture. Christ is born in the Roman Empire. But how did the Romans get across the Mediterranean? Like that sort of stuff. When we look at the world of Exodus, for instance, I mean, what we have is the enslavement of God's people under the Egyptians. It's kind of a big deal, don't you think? You know, like how the heck did that even happen? And so what history does is it gives a cradle, it gives a bedrock to understanding the great spiritual truths that rage around us. Here's a perfect example of this. I'll be quick. In Matthew 16, we have to understand where he took him. He took him to Caesarea Philippi. Well, what is Caesarea Philippi? So, you read that and you're like, okay, well, who cares? Like, Jesus just putzes around his apostles to the ends of the earth. Okay. Caesarea Philippi is a particular region located in a province called Banias, in Latin Panis, and Pan is the god of shepherds. In Caesarea Philippi, this is all coming from Stephen Ray's Upon This Rock, one of the best apologetic talks on history, and Stephen Ray is a wonderful resource for history of the church. There was a giant rock in Caesarea Philippi that Christ went to. This giant rock had the carving of many little gods and shrines, and then it had a giant carving to Caesar. So Christ is not just taking him out there to Caesarea Philippi randomly. Christ is taken to a place and he looks upon a giant rock and he says, behold, upon this rock is built a false church and false gods. And it's upon you that I am placing a real rock, and upon this rock I will build my church. If one looks at that, that's an entire history that the Bible, for the sake of everything, can't be recorded in it, as it says in the end of John, but enough that you come out to believe. But to understand that history, you suddenly understand that Christ isn't just making this willy-nilly decision. Everything is seeped in the history. And to understand how the Roman Empire was at the time, to understand why St. Paul was both a Jew and a Roman citizen, to understand how Abraham could have ended up having more descendants than the stars in the sky, or as numerous as the sands on the beaches. All of it is just seeped in such a wonderful history. And the funny thing is this, God interacts with us. So it's true. So it's not just some nice little fluffy feeling we have about spirituality. History demonstrates that Christ has a plan for his people, and it shows it in real time.
God said, I will build my church. That's a very important statement. I will build my church. Not many churches that look like me, that may resemble me, but they're not very close. My church. What does that mean? His church. What does that one church look like?
This is obviously the $44,000 denomination question.
This is the hard hitter.
Because there are about 44,000 denominations right now.
Yeah.
Cardinal Henry Newman, St. Cardinal Henry Newman, wrote, has a very famous quote, which is, "To be steeped in history is to cease to be Protestant." And that might ruffle a couple tail feathers, but the truth ought to ruffle a couple tail feathers. It does it for us. Jesus Christ founded the Roman Catholic Church. He gave 4 marks of the church: 1, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. What does it mean? Christ understood that the time, so again, this is the historical connection. You have to understand that if you're going to find the scriptures back then, you would have gone to a synagogue and you would have found oftentimes couple things. You would have found the Torah, right? The Pentateuch in Greek. You would have found the 5 books, first books of the Old Testament. You would have found a lot of the writings of the judges and of the prophets, of course. And also, if you were a Greek Jew, which is actually Hellenized Jew, might be more accurate, which is actually what the whole region of Galilee was under. If you read Maccabees, that's what it shows. You would have had the Septuagint, and that was the translation of the Old Testament into Greek. Because Hebrew, a lot of people you could speak a little bit of Hebrew, of course, growing up as a Jew, but reading for anybody is going to be very difficult. So when Christ finds a church, he understands that reading, it's an extraordinarily low literacy rate. And most people know the stories of the Bible as we know it, not because they read them, but because it's been passed down for ages. The point being is this: there needed to be a safeguard of what truth was going to be, which is why, again, in Matthew 16, he says, "Thou art Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." Christ didn't say, "Thou art Peter, and on this rock I'm going to write a whole bunch of new scriptures and we're going to place them in and everything." The funny thing is, when we talk about sola scriptura, which is the historical Bible alone maxim that Martin Luther had, there is no place in the Bible that supports sola scriptura. So the response is when people say, "I only believe in things in the Bible," is, where do you find that in the Bible? So when someone says, "Where do you find the Catholic Church in the Bible?" You can point to Matthew 16, but here's a bigger question. The New Testament, right, wasn't just like the 23, I think it is, books of the New Testament. I might be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure that's about right. Didn't just plop out of the sky, right? In fact, during the first 4 centuries of the church, there were hundreds of manuscripts. This church over here thought that the Gospel of John was valid, but also Shepherd of Hermes. This church thought that the Gospel of Mary Magdalene was valid. This church over here thought that the Gospel of Judas was valid. So how do you know? If God doesn't give a referee for the game, then you're going to have the same thing we have now, which is 44,000 denominations that really adamantly believe that you can only have a Bible alone sort of church. So God rather gave the authority to open and close the canon of Scripture by the power of the Holy Spirit to the apostles, namely to St. Peter, right? To Peter alone did he say, "I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven whatsoever," and then to later the apostles, but only to the powers to loose and to bind, but only the keys to St. Peter. Why? Because as St. Ignatius of Antioch said very early on, he was a disciple of St. Paul. Wherever there is Christ, there's a Catholic Church. And how do you know where you find the Catholic Church? Because it always has a visible head. To tie that back in, it took 4 centuries for biblical scholars under the aegis of the Roman Catholic Church, which means underneath the aegis of the Pope, to say this book is not inspired, this book is inspired. God didn't provide a random blueprint out of the sky for any of that, except one blueprint, and that is Holy Mother Church. And that's why in the history of the Catholic Church, it's the only institution, one of the oldest, if not the oldest surviving institution in the world. And it's never once gone back on its doctrines, its teachings, or its dogmas. The Church of Martin Luther has fallen away now, right? Martin Luther would never recognize the modern day Lutheran Church. Look what's happened with the Anglican Church, Look what's happened with the Presbyterian Church, the Methodist Church, Look what's happened with the right in this country where we're driven by an evangelical spirit. We've had to have 3 great awakenings. The fact of the matter is the Roman Catholic Church, in its core, in its teachings, has remained unchanged for 2,000 years. And that's something that doesn't happen. It simply doesn't happen unless there is something greater behind it. And so you begin to look at the history of the church. What preserved the Bible the best way? How about the church that decided to sanction it in the first place?
Beautiful, beautiful. Wow.
Thank God, not me.
Oh, man. I think we've been given a lot to contemplate on. But again, history shows for itself. So you want to learn more about it. You want to know why everything is important, especially within your faith. Look back on history. Yeah. It'll reveal all that you need to know. And then Christ will reveal even more. Thank you so much, Jordan, for coming on.
Thank you, brother, the sister.
Thank you. And please support his podcast. We love these guys, Rudy and Jordan. They're awesome. They're awesome and awesome. Thank you all for watching. And please remember to like and subscribe. Have a good one. Thank you.